really fascinating. So it reminds me of work by Shader and Christensen, who also say that language adapts to learnability. But I always sort of get stuck on the learnability because the first generation learned it, so it's learnable. But isn't it really more about efficiency and sort of how disambiguating the language becomes?
Yes, but I would add to that things are, whether or not something is efficient is gonna depend on the learning structure and also the ecology of the language, what else is developed, right? So these things can be more or less deterministic depending on sort of where the ball has gone. So for example, these kinds of spatial devices show up and we get the same pattern in sign language after sign language that aren't in contact with each other. And we think, well, oh, is that innately specified that languages are going to have spatial agreement, but it only is something that a sign language can even do? So it seems like, how specifically do you want to have that in your learning device? Or is this convergent evolution because its asymmetrical use of space is something that can be exploited, and so when you need something like transitivity, you're going to take advantage of that. And sign language, and it's so easy and efficient, and word order with the particular apparatus that you have when you're signing is very slow and very gross, and it takes a lot longer to produce more signs, right? So yes, I mean, I could talk for a while about how I differ from Christensen and Shader. I think that it's really I think there's two cycles of evolution here, right? So there is this adaptation to the human learner by a language over time, but that can't be where language came from originally, because the learning devices themselves have to have evolved. And the people that, all of our systems or whatever we have, whatever mechanisms we have, the evolutionary processes that shape those aren't the same things that are shaping the languages themselves, right? So a language emergence today can be very rapid and over a couple of generations and really fit the learner pretty quickly, but you can't go all the way back with that story, because initially, as people were using means to communicate, but the things that there are some things that would make a better language for a different reason, right? So things that made a better language early on were things like, if we all happen to have the same kind of predisposition, then we will arrive at the same kind of language, and then the people who have that kind of predisposition will be favored somehow. Very familiar with this argument, I think. But so that the kind of pressures those are the kinds of pressures that are going to shape learning devices, just to be not just. I mean, in fact, you don't need to build in be really efficient, because that's something that you can get just by using the language. So when you ask what has to get built in, it's actually going to be more arbitrary things that will just make people happen to arise at the same kind of languages as each other, at the same kinds of solutions as each other. So the evolution of language in humans has to be this change of systems to be effective at creating a language that then can be compatible with other people. Whereas today, it's having a language that's learnable in this short term of how a language emerges. It emerges in the context of the all of the learning things that we've evolved. I know that's not clear. I have to think of a way to, but yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I have two quick questions. One is, because of these differences across cohorts, one of the things I would be interested in is, have you investigated interactions between, for example, members of the fourth cohort and members of the first cohort? So is there a problem of kind of understanding each other? Or is it something like the fourth cohort adapts to the first cohort, like you would when you talk to some older individual, you might switch and speak differently.
Right.
And then when you talk to your cohort, you then use a different kind of code. And the second question, which is more a clarification question, as you could see yesterday, I do investigate other species as well, and so you kept talking about language evolution. And I would like to understand why you call it language evolution rather than language change. And in which sense, for you, this is evolution? Because when I think about evolution, I think about increasing fitness and something that occurs over a long period of time. It doesn't have to be millions of years, but it has to be not necessarily from one generation to another while we're still sort of interacting with each other. But you have repeated this multiple times, so I would like to understand why do you think that's evolution?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. The first question is a fun one to answer, actually. So I have done tasks with cross-cohort communication, and I have lovely videos of these miscommunication between a first cohort aunt and a second cohort nephew who grew up in the same household, where they're doing a shielded communication task, and they have to, it's the man and tree task that was developed at the Max Planck Institute for studying spatial language. So they're describing the spatial relations between objects. And I thought that this part would come for free, right? You're representing space with space. This for me was going to be the starting point. I was seeing these changes in verbs of movement, and I thought, okay, let me just talk about stable locations first. But they kept, even though he had learned to sign from her, and you know, she's 10 years older than him, he was making these distinctions in the signing space that she didn't. So he would sign something to the left and something else to the right, and she would half the time pick a mirror image picture for her match. So there were miscommunications, and they were shocked, right? They didn't, in their daily lives, ever notice that they didn't, because the context, you don't usually wonder who's doing what to whom, what, you know, it's usually fairly clear, and there are other ways in the sentence that you can, like, figure out who's doing things. So he had never noticed that he used this more specific version of the language than her. And another example is from this study, this comprehension study that I showed the data from, this task. In fact, the stimuli used in this were signing that I had elicited from the individuals the previous few years before. They were the man give, woman receive kinds of things. But I was showing people their own signing and signing from people of other cohorts. And the first cohort signers were random in what direction they would sign something, and the second cohort signers were specific, and specifically they did a rotated representation of what relative to the event in the world. And they interpreted everything as if it had a rotated representation. So they had to watch the event and then pick a picture of what the event looked like. And so the second cohort signers would consistently pick the more, they would say, this can only refer to this event in which the man gives to the woman. It could not refer to this event in which the woman gives to the man. Even if it was a first cohort signer who had been signing, or what way did I say, the woman gives to the, signing it the other way. So half, and they were counterbalanced, in fact, for whether they were rotated or unrotated. So for half of the items, the second cohort signers, in fact, picked the picture that was the mirror image of the one that had been the original stimulus to the signer. So they were giving it this, they were not accommodating in that way. They were more restricted, and they didn't do this. There are other ways they definitely are more accommodating. So I asked in the comprehension task, I asked them in the debriefing whether you could have signed it the other way or whether it could have been the other picture. And I asked that in that second cohort, there were 3 kids who had really different responses that I thought was very telling. One of them was 14, and he said, well, older people would sign it that way, but I wouldn't. You know, sometimes people sign it that way. The middle one said, well, you know, it maybe could mean, I don't think it could mean that too. The second one was like a little bit less, I would never sign it that way, but other people do. Oh yeah, I guess the first one was like, sometimes you could sign it that way, but it's not quite as good. The second was, I would never sign it that way, but maybe some older people do. And the third person, who was 10, said, no, like if you meant that, you wouldn't be signing that. That's not what it means. So there's definitely, even within that cohort, there's this change in comprehension. Now, the second question about why do I call it evolution, and I think this is an important thing. I definitely think that this other thing that you want to call evolution, of course, is evolutionary, but and evolutionary processes but what I think is important here is that the language really does evolve. It isn't just a metaphor for change. It's a specific kind of change. It's a kind of change that comes about over the course of, as you said, this process of replication and selection that leads to an increased fitness. That's what's happening here to a language. The thing that's hard to grok about is that it's an abstract system that you're talking about. So it's not a concrete thing like a physical, biological body. It's the rules and whatever they are, the patterns or whatever it is that is what a language is. But whatever it is, it's clearly something that's abstract. It's an organization of information. It's something that's shared in all of our minds. And the question for linguists to figure out is actually what's the nature of that structure. Like how defined is it? But whatever it is, it evolves over time and it replicates. And so the reason I think it's important to study change is because that's when we will get to probe at what it is. And so acquisition is really important. If you have a reanalysis of some kind of construction where you're using that system that you have in your mind to parse some student input, and you're seeing this noun-verb thing as flat, like you might look at it and then say, oh, I need to find some asymmetry and hierarchy in the structure. So whether or not the person who produced it has that in there, you read it as if it does, right? So at some point in this comprehending of an utterance, there was this hierarchical, asymmetrical reading imposed on it. And so at that point, the system that got created in that younger mind was different from the system that passed it down, and it was because of the way that input got parsed, and it made the system more fit to the child learner, so then that gets to get passed down again. So that's why I call it evolution. It is an evolutionary process. It's subject to things like, it benefits from variety and proliferation and lots of utterances happening and lots of different pairings, and every dyadic interaction is one of a potential for change and reanalysis, and people are constantly dynamically changing the languages in their mind. Does that answer your question? So it is evolution, but that moment that changes, the changing of the system with every dynamic interaction, is not the same one that's the human biological evolution changing over time.
So we need to stop.
Okay.
Please save your questions for the discussion because we are also limited by time.